looking for something I couldn't find anywhere else. But I don't want to be nobody, just want a chance to be myself.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Exploring the Omnivore Universe, which is a series devoted to the exciting and eclectic releases by Omnivore Recordings. Not just a reissue label, Omnivore also releases new music, including recent albums by Lizard Music and Urge Overkill. However, on this episode, we are going to focus on the amazing series of reissues the label has recently done with the catalog of Buck Owens. But before we chat about Buck Owens, I'm going to introduce my guest. First off, you should all be familiar with Ronnie Barnett. He may own a platinum record for his work with the Muffs, but he's also the co-host of Beach Blanket Fort Bingo right here on my channel. And he's the star of Ronnie Barnett's Boom Boom Room and so many other great shows on the interwebs. And he's a big Buck Owens fan too. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Ronnie Barnett.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve, on this discussion.
Our next guest, I first met this gentleman nearly 2 decades ago. In fact, we worked for the same company for several years. And since we parted ways, he's not only released My Favorite Revolution, one of the finest guitar pop albums of the last 20 years, he's also become well known as an exceptional guitarist. So exceptional, in fact, that he has been playing lead guitar with Dwight Yoakam for 10 years. And he's taken time out of his busy career to come here and chat about the music and influence of Buck Owens. Ladies and gentlemen, EUGENE Edwards.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. Hi, Ronnie.
You know, let's dive into what we came here for, the legend that is Buck Owens and, of course, his Buckaroos. Now, first off, do you remember the first time you heard Buck and did his music click right away?
Okay, so I do remember first time I heard Buck, I was born in 1973. So I became aware of Buck as one of the hosts of Hee Haw, which, you know, I guess my grandparents probably watched it. And so there was this kind of older congenial guy. He and Roy Clark are essentially doing Rowan Martin's Laugh-In, but with this country angle. That's the whole point of the show. So he's just this kind of polite, happy-go-lucky guy with a red, white, and blue acoustic guitar. And to be honest, I didn't take him extremely seriously musically. Then, around somewhere in the mid '80s, I actually at a thrift store I got the Live at Carnegie Hall album, and it was probably for $1. I almost said for $1. Terrible, trying to avoid the puns. I thought, wow, look, Buck Owens was a young person at some point. Really, it was just like maybe 10 years. So I got it, and I couldn't believe how vicious of a band it was live. Like, it just was like a bullet through my skull. It was just so tight, fast. They just played with such a fiery energy. They kind of played ahead of the beat as a band. It had a really, really direct energy that really caught my attention. And then actually, and around that same time, Dwight's career was catching fire, and I was watching from afar, growing up in Southern Arizona. And so that relationship, this kind of like, wait, so Buck, and then because of what Dwight was doing at the time, it made me go back and find more of the original Buck Owens albums, and then my view of him shifted dramatically. Plus, by then I already had my first electric guitar, which I have behind me here, but which is a Fender Telecaster, which we'll talk about a little later about how that plays into the Buck legend and that original sound. So it all sort of came around by the late '80s for me. But no, it required a second act for me. And now, of course, his music and that stuff, it dominates my professional career, frankly.
Eugene's like a little kid, right? Born in '73. So
Yeah.
It's very cute. It's very cute, Eugene. I was born in 1965, so kind of similar, but yeah, I grew up in Houston, Texas. My parents listened to country music. They didn't listen to Buck Owens, but kind of like Eugene, Hee Haw was on TV. So I knew Buck as a TV guy, as a goofy TV guy. Yeah, I didn't know he had this rich career, right? Another pun, rich career, right? You know, my parents listened to like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and stuff, which was fine, but I wasn't really into it at the time. But what got me into country music, and maybe this goes for you too, Steve, was Elvis Costello's Almost Blue record. That record came out and I was like, oh my God, this Merle Haggard song is great. And this George Jones song is great. And I went and discovered those guys, and kind of like Eugene said, I was a Dwight Yoakam fan, and when Streets of Bakersfield came out in '88, I went and saw Dwight on that tour. And besides, shaking his ass in the tight pants, Dwight brought out Buck Owens for like the encore for a little mini set, and I was just hooked immediately. And then by that time, I was a writer in Houston, writing for the weekly paper. Buck made a comeback album after that called Hot Dog, in 1988. But I got to interview Buck, and it's a great tape. And Buck was, I wish I could I'll play it for you guys sometime. But Buck was very honest. He was like talking about his career and how when you're popping up out of cornfields, it's not real conducive to being taken seriously, Ronnie. He called me Ronnie all the time. Which is very true. But Buck, and then he came to town, and kind of like Eugene said, even the band at that point, when I wrote about him, I compared him to the Ramones, because they just like did song after song after song, very little talking. And I went and got all the records. I have them all except one. Anyway, Buck's been a part of my life ever since then.
I mean, he seems to have created, or at least perfected, several significant musical formulas that have continued to fuel country artists today, including Dwight and the Mavericks and many others. Now, what do you consider his most important contribution to today's country? Because there's a lot of things, from the dominance of Tom Brumley's pedal steel, those cold openings, you're just hit with those vocals right away. The dual vocal harmonies, the tracks fueled by Don Rich's guitar licks. Do you think they all helped to change the landscape of country music?
Yeah, well, definitely. Around the time Buck came out, there was a lot of real syrupy country music, like Jim Reeves and stuff, stuff with strings and stuff. Eugene will get into this, but Buck played a Fender Telecaster. It was a real twangy sound, and it was unheard of at the time in country music. And also, it comes back to songwriting for me too. I mean, Buck's songwriting is unbelievable. The melodies and the vocals, and I mean, to think that he had he put out 3 albums a year, multiple number one. It's unbelievable. Like for a 10-year stretch there, he probably put out 30 records, and they're all pretty great.
And they charted like crazy. Like crazy. So Buck was so a lot of his innovations are very stark. It's not a nuanced tale when we talk about Buck's sound, what we now just call the Bakersfield sound. But I'm going to pull back a little bit on the history of why Buck sounds the way he does. And there's a few important things. One key figure in this is a man named Ken Nelson, who was a guy who was originally from the Minnesota area. He's actually a big band jazz era guy, but he gets hired as the A&R guy at Capitol Records in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And Ken had this philosophy, particularly with country bands on the West Coast. He let the artist use his own band on the recordings. Now, if you were a Nashville recording artist in the 50s or 60s, that would not be the case. You used the A-list session players, whoever played on Patsy Cline's records or Jim Reeves' records, was also going to play on your record if you were a singer. That was just how it was. Now, there's a lot of advantages. That a lot of the same musicians are on Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde and Nashville Skyline record. So they were very capable musicians. That's not the point. The point is there was a very consistent product coming out of Nashville in that era. Mm-hmm. Now, when Capitol Records located in Hollywood, this is a trip over the grapevine from Bakersfield to a lot of these bands. So same thing with Merle Haggard and his Stranger. It was going to be your road band is the studio band. Now, this gives a certain autonomy to the artist. Buck started as the lead guitar player for a guy named Tommy Collins, who really was the original king of Bakersfield at the time. And then Ken Nelson really, really liked the way Buck played guitar. It was a really distinctive tone and things, and they began a relationship. And as Buck started singing a little more and writing songs, that's how Buck ended up a Capitol recording artist. Now, a little bit about, we're really talking about the difference between Bakersfield and Nashville. That's really where this story begins. This is where the Red Sea parts, if you will. Nashville, like Ronnie says, there's a lot of strings. Nashville has always been trying to achieve some sort of legitimacy. It always has as a company town. Nothing wrong with that. Chet Atkins moves into Nashville in the 50s, and he gets the A&R gig, and he starts producing records. And the whole thing is to take us out of this sort of dusty Appalachian, very rustic, rural sound, the rough edges of Hank Williams, if you will, and put some polish on it. This was just so we could become much more legitimate and sell more records to more middle America. Fine. That's why Nashville sounds the way it does. Also, I'll talk about why the instruments that they were using in Nashville makes a difference. Bakersfield, however, is a very rough and tumble place. There's a bit of an oil boom there, and there's a lot of agriculture work there. So a lot of the people that would go out to the clubs on Fridays and Saturdays had been working really hard manual labor all week. You also had many cultures. You had people who were products of the Dust Bowl migration. You had migrant workers coming up from Mexico. So you have this mix of cultures coming on, and they'll have a lot of cash on Friday and Saturday nights, and they're ready to release some energy in these clubs, the Blackboard being one of them. So this is where Buck comes out of. And that scene creates a few necessities. One of them is it's very dark and very smoky. So you put rhinestones on your jacket so you can just be seen. Also, the biggest music or guitar and amplifier manufacturer nearby is Fender over in Fullerton, California. So you're going to play Fender instruments. You're going to play a very streamlined form of music that actually has a lot more relationship to the blues than the Nashville country at the time had more of a relationship with jazz. So, for instance, a Nashville player at the time for a guitar lick fill on a country song would probably play something that has a little more jazz to it. But if you played in the Bakersfield scene, you kind of play more of a streamlined blues thing. And this is what Buck was playing as a lead guitar player. And Buck essentially taught Don Rich how to play guitar. So when we hear a Buck Owens record, even though the song could be in a real major and happy key, like in G major, we hear as the guitar fills are really kind of minor blues. You also hear this really bright, snappy, aggressive sound coming from the Fender Telecaster. Well, when Buck got into the studio, they didn't rough the edges of any of this. So the strongs are very streamlined, the instrumentation was very streamlined, and the parts are very streamlined. And this really, really jumps out in radio when it's mixed among Jim Reeves, Eddie Arnold, Patsy Cline, what have you. If I may, one more thing in terms of just why Buck's records sat a little differently than other records at the time. The lore is this: they were doing a week's worth of gigs in Arizona somewhere, and they had a switch of steel players. The other steel player had another gig to do. So they get Brumley, actually, who was in Texas, but willing to make the trip over. And Brumley says, "Do I need to bring a pedal steel?" And Buck, no, we have one. So he gets there the afternoon of the show, and he goes to tune up the pedal steel, which had pretty much been in storage for a while. And to tune it up to pitch, one or two of the strings kept breaking. And we're just running out of strings, we're running out of time. So there'd be less stress on the pedal steel. Buck makes the executive decision, hell, everybody just tune down half a step this week until we can get this thing fixed. So they tune the guitars down half a step by pitch. Not enough to the audience is going to notice. Who cares? What Buck knows is at the end of the week, his voice is in great shape for singing in a smoky bar for a full week. He's saying, dang, I don't know that we should go back up to concert pitch. This is kind of comfortable. So this carries over into the studio. And so Buck's records, instead of being in G, a song would be in G flat. Instead of being in A, it'd be in A flat. Instead of E, it's E flat. So just even the sheer pitch of a lot of his really, really famous records sit a half step away from the record you heard before it and the record you heard after. Even the commercials that played on radio at the time were sitting in a different pitch level than his records. This is so significant that and I'm sure we'll mention it, when the Beatles do a cover of Act Naturally, it's one of the few instances where George Harrison tunes his Gretsch down a whole step so he can get a little more of that Don Rich timbre out of his guitar. So to play to play Act Naturally on guitar as the Beatles record it, your hands would show an A, but your ear here's a G, a concert G, so to speak. So that's how he can play these. It's really, really interesting how there's all these little mothers of invention sort of moments in Buck's career that ends up creating the sound. Also just the EQ and using Capitol Studios instead. It's all sorts of stuff that piles into that.
You hear that, folks? Buck was tuning down before Black Sabbath.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. Might win an Oscar, you can't the storm, 'cause I can play the part so well.
Buck's records had a distinct, in my opinion, rockabilly influence, but he never really sounded rockabilly. He never really sounded like anybody else during his entire career. I mean, do you feel that he was one step ahead, or do you think that he was just in a completely different musical universe?
Well, I mean, it was Buck bringing in those influences that weren't that traditional country thing. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
The guitar that's cutting through. Buck was taking in all kinds of music, rockabilly, rock, blues, everything, and kind of distilling it into that thing that he had. And like Eugene said, on a weekend night at the Blackboard, doing however many sets he did, having to cut through everything. It was very unique at the time.
Well, it was extremely unique, and of course it set the template for what we then call the Bakersfield sound. Buck has already dominated, just really dominates the country charts. Whenever Buck started releasing, especially after '63 when Act Naturally hits, anything Buck puts out just goes straight to the top. It was just a crazy success rate. And I think Buck, there was a couple of things about Buck's personal story that are pretty significant. Now, of course, his family had come out of Texas as part of the Dust Bowl migration. And that poverty left a very, very indelible mark on Buck. We know that he became an extremely successful businessman. He branched out into owning radio stations and TV. And we talked about how the ownership of the very, very shrewd businessman. He talked to Dwight personally because they got so close. But his reaction to his childhood poverty was that he would never be poor again. And I think his business acumen was always a part of all decisions, including the musical decisions. He tells a story when his family was still in Arizona. Actually, they hadn't even made it all the way to California, and he might have been 5 or 6 years old. And he had about a nickel or a dime. He had some change from somewhere. And so there was a store that sold candy, and he was very excited to go buy some candy for himself. He went in, and he gets the candy, puts it on the counter, and the store owner says, "Can't you read?" And Buck says, "Yeah, kind of." And he points to a sign, and it said, "No Okies allowed." And as Buck tells the story, he says, "Dwight, thing is, I wasn't even from Oklahoma." But he felt a discrimination, so it definitely left its mark. And so I can't help but think that when he went into the studio with his own band, being protected by Ken Nelson, because Lord knows there was probably pressure. Well, this doesn't sound like what's selling on the country market. Someone had to protect them. So I know, but this is what we're going to do anyway. But I think he was shrewd enough to think, wait a minute, yeah, let's keep our guitars tuned differently. Also, the EQ, those records are extremely bright. There's a lot of treble. There's not a lot of low end on Buck Owens records. They just sit in the mix. They sound so much different than what's coming out of Nashville, which is a very lush countrypolitan thing was going on at that time. I'll tell you, we were, this is a rather unfulfilled story, but a couple of years ago, we were playing at the Ryman. And then we did what you tend to do afterwards. You leave the dressing room, you cross the alley, and you go into the bars, either Tootsie's or Roberts right across the way there. Ronnie's probably been there too. So we went, and we were in Roberts, and the guy on drums is Willie Cantu. And so we are just thrilled because we can't wait for them to take a break. And then we're just going to mob him. And I've got a list of technical questions to ask about those recordings. What did you use? Because, I mean, look, sometimes you listen, that hi-hat, was it a folding chair? Is that even a cymbal? Is it a bicycle spoke? What is that sound? Well, unfortunately, this is one he was on break, and he went by, and I kind of introduced myself, and he couldn't have cared less. He just had to go to the restroom. He didn't want to, and he really, and then later on, he says, "You understand? I was basically a teenager. I don't remember. It was a Tuesday in June.
Yeah.
We just get it right. I don't, I think, oh, he doesn't remember anything about mic placement. But it's significant though when we talk about those Beatles, the Capitol releases were mostly mastered there at Capitol, same spot where Buck's records are mastered. So there is this. I always heard an EQ similarity between the Beatles' Capitol stuff and Buck's Capitol stuff. So, and I also think this is I think Buck was always looking for an advantage, whether it was in the tuning, in the mix, because that high-end mix is gonna really, really poke out on AM radio, which was dominant in the 60s, of course. That's really gonna, AM doesn't really carry a lot of bass frequency. So you kind of, so he just thought, I'm going to maximize, this is will really pop out of the speakers. Songwriting wise, so many of those songs started, yes, with the bare vocal opening, and they start with the chorus.
Yeah.
I've got a tiger by the, we're off, we're running, they're going to put me in the movies. Everything starts with the chorus. And then the verse is this little aside that supports the notion of the chorus. And we go back to the chorus. Dwight paid very direct tribute on a lot of his hits. You've got your little ways. He even pronounces those first words as Buck. And a lot of Dwight's hits started with the chorus. He took that format. Merle Haggard kind of did this quite a bit too on some of his hits. But yeah, I think he was always like, start with the chorus. Beatles would do that too. I think he was always looking for this competitive advantage. And so it's no accident that he was a #1 artist for so long.
You know, I'm referring right now to maybe the later half of the 60s and into the early 70s. He introduced a lot of different sounds into his music, but he really never really drew attention to them because every song had that distinct Buck sound or Buckaroo sound. He wasn't afraid to do different things on the albums. Over the years, have there been songs or albums that you've discovered new sounds that maybe you didn't hear before, maybe you didn't expect?
I just want to say, I love hearing this breakdown on everything that has gone over my head all these years. That I totally understand, you know. But Buck, you know, in the late 60s, Buck was doing some innovative stuff. One of my favorites is a song called Who's Gonna Mow Your Grass?
Oh my gosh. Yes. That's one of the songs I was thinking of.
And it's just really innovative, like chord changes and the arrangement and everything.
Who's gonna bring you your breakfast in bed? Who's gonna whisper good night? Who's gonna keep you warm as toast on those cold winter nights? And who's gonna be your puppy dog when I'm a thing of the past? Hey, who's gonna mow your grass?
I just want to add too, like later in his career, Buck had a place called the Crystal Palace where he'd perform on weekends for $5. And I went like 10 times over the years. And
oh, that's great.
I went with my wife once, and they would always like do this bit where they take dedications, and Buck would do the same joke. It was not our anniversary, but I said it was. And Buck would always have the same joke, whether it was like 43-year anniversary or 5. He'd be like, 43 years. Same woman. So I did that. I requested Who's Gonna Mow Your Grass, and they played it even later in his career like that. Yeah. So, and I have a DVD. They would sell DVDs if you wish to buy, and I have that. So that was a special thing to be able to see Buck like that later in his career. Again, I'm getting ahead of the game, but
no, but that story is a great tribute to Buck's business acumen. There's a lot to this.
Yeah. Now, Eugene, is there any buried gem that surprised you?
A buried gem? Well, the story. It's a twist on this in that it's one of the big hits, but it was probably on my 200th or 500th listen that something dawned on me. The biggest ballad of his career was Together Again, and it's extremely slow ballad. It's just this. There's such a melancholy and a sadness to it that I overlooked that the title is Together Again. It is so he sings so beautifully on it, and of course Brumley's steel solo is legendary. I mean, a lot of guys broke strings just trying to figure out what's going on over the 5 chord on that brilliant solo. Which turned out, the more I met more pedal steel players, I started to appreciate just how landmark that particular solo is. But it didn't occur to me that the lyrics, the text of the song is just very, very happy. But man, you don't feel it. So I always wonder, like, well, wait a minute, is the sound of this music what it's like when they're not together? Is he still remorseful that they broke up at all in the first place, that they had to reunite? I mean, this what I thought was a very obvious record has so many more question marks in it. And this is just the type of stuff that you get from the great artists. We can go back and still hear new things or nuances. It's just because the thing about Buck is, for a country artist, these songs are mostly very, very positive. you know, Above and
Mm-hmm.
Beyond,
Mhm.
you know, a Tiger by the Tail. These are, you know, love songs. These are usually a man who's thrilled about being in love and is excited to tell other people about it, which is not always a sentiment that we get with most of the country music. Another thing, though, in terms of deep cuts, you know, we forget that Streets of Bakersfield, as it was recorded in the 70s, was not a single. It was really just an album cut
Mm-hmm.
of Bucks.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until he suggested to Dwight that they do it for a television broadcast in the 80s. And they brought in Flaco Jimenez, which was a masterstroke of referring
Yeah.
to again, one of the disparate influences that Buck had in Bakersfield, having that norteño accordion in there. It's a really, really shrewd record that they made there in the 80s, the recut of it. That goes to #1. But we forget that before that, it was a relatively obscure number. Dwight
Mm-hmm.
just recently, because we were just doing shows in Nashville, and Dwight and that broadcast was done there at the Ryman, and Dwight's career had pretty much been mostly based out of Hollywood, and he was an LA guy. And so Nashville was kind of had a suspicion about Dwight early on, didn't really trust him a whole lot. And of all things, Buck says, "Hey, Dwight, I want you to come to Nashville. We're going to do this television show, and we're going to do Streets of Bakersfield together." And Dwight's like, "You think that's a good idea? I mean, you don't know me, you don't like me, this outsider kind of anthem, and they're
Mm-hmm.
not really taken to me that well as it is, and I don't, Dwight, just trust me, it's gonna work out." And as Dwight says, every time Buck gave Dwight advice, Dwight says, "I didn't always take his advice, but Buck was always right."
Yeah, it's on this record, which
There you go.
is on Omnivore, but it's from 1973, so it's definitely, the whole album is obscure, right? Buck wasn't
That's true.
necessarily
Yes,
selling
that's right.
great, you know, in great numbers at this point, but this record is less than 25 minutes too. Like,
You want to talk about Ramones?
yeah. 10
Yeah.
songs, 24 and a half minutes. Yeah.
While we're talking about Omnivore recordings, the complete Capitol singles, 1957 and 1975, you can buy it either as a 6 CD set or as 3 separate 2 CD sets, and it's stunning. I really wasn't a fan of mono up until about a year ago, and some of these recordings are perfect examples of why I love it so much now, because it's so forceful and it hits you like a train. And this catalog it's somewhat amazing to experience all this music and to know that for years a lot of the stuff was out of print. Is there a particular album both of you would stand by, maybe a personal favorite?
Well, I get asked that a lot, and I feel like my answer changes like crazy. The Live in Japan record, which was probably maybe the third one of his that I got, really stands out to me. Again, the Carnegie Hall record was the one that I first became strongly with which I became familiar, but I didn't understand just first of all, how rare it was for a country artist to play in Japan. Just was not happening at that time in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also, I think it's very, very startling. I mean, I talk about that energy and how that band was they were just like a cannon. But it really points out how efficient they were, that there's not this not a massive difference from the studio performances. That band knew what they were doing. And so that Live in Japan album is one that really, really does. Plus, their stage costumes that you see are just really to die for. I mean, it's just, there was no mistaking who the artist was on that day. Buck believed in show business. And so that's the one in my heart. That's the one that really, really like stays with me. Plus it acts as a bit of a greatest hits at the time, obviously. So it kind of doubles in that way.
Yeah. Ronnie,
is sheer track listing.
Yeah. Can you imagine the spectacle in Japan in 1967 or whatever of those 5 guys in those suits? Like
exactly.
God, that song "Made in Japan" is one of my favorites too. Right? Like
that's a really good call in terms of gems that many people don't know. Yeah, that's a great one from that era.
And that's the thing. I do not have a clear-cut favorite Buck album. You know, they all have gems on them, and kind of like Eugene said, that could change from moment to moment. So I just think it's a very consistent body of work.
Yeah.
See, I think that's the sign of a great artist, is the fact that both of you are stumped on what's your favorite Buck album. I mean, you really have to think deep about it, and you have to say, well, today it's this. because tomorrow you're going to
Yeah.
wake up and it's going to be something else. To me, that there's such a rich catalog. I know that Sundays did some of the earlier Bucks, but I think I'm discovering more gems, more heartfelt recordings, more passion in like the later things, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, one of the gems is a song called "Close Up the Honky Tonks," which is another really beautiful. Now, it's been redone by some artists as a slightly slower ballad. Buck's take on is a little more upper mid tempo, but the notion of the song is again one of those things where the tempo and the feel of it kind of belie the sadness of the lyrics. It's a bit of an inverse of Together Again. By the way, also just want to correction. I forgot Carnegie Hall album came out in '66. In Japan is '67. So Japan is the second live album. But to me, it's just that band's just a little more on fire. That's just kind of another.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of make that correction in there because I know we'll have those people will point that out, and they're correct to do so. Also, it's not insignificant that I think when Ray Charles very, very importantly did his country western material in the '60s. It always did. I always did notice that the most successful of that material was when he did Buck tunes. I really dig the arrangements of like "Hey Good Looking" and stuff like that. But to me, even with "Crying Time" and "Together Again," the ballads, it seemed like Ray really had a hold of that material from the get-go, and he really let the songs carry that stuff as opposed to letting the genre transition carry over. It's just a hallmark of great songwriting. Right. And so it's just a good example. When you listen to someone else do a Buck tune to really understand how significant Buck was. We haven't even discussed too much that the Beatles, obviously, when they were going to cover a straight up cover of a contemporary artist, by the way.
We look back and, now we go, man, they were doing like an old tune. No, they were doing it, 6 months after it came out, maybe even less than that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something to say. I mean, in terms of, when they took a crack at a modern country hit, that was the one. And then of course when they try to write their own and What Goes On, there's really only one artist that they're clearly mimicking. It's just unmistakable,
Yeah.
Buck really came to commercial prominence in '69 when he started hosting Hee Haw, which is really how I think all of us came to know him. Now he continued to record albums, but his image changed, thanks to the goofy nature of that TV show. He still was making great albums, but do you think that his music wasn't taken as seriously because people saw him as this kind of silly goofball?
Well, definitely. I can point to that line I told you earlier that Buck himself said to me in 1988 about popping up out of cornfields. People aren't going to take you seriously after, And also, Buck did make some goofy records in that era. He made that "It's a Monsters Holiday" one, and you know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, Buck did some goof. You're not going to have Buck.
Look.
Yeah, there it is. You're not going to have Buck to push around anymore, or whatever that song's called. And also, but we should say at that point where Buck starts doing Hee Haw, he's got another TV show he does as well, the Buck Ranch, Radio Ranch, or whatever it's called. Eugene. Yeah. I mean, Buck just worked his tail off, and when Hee Haw starts, he starts doing. Here's another plug. Records with Susan Ray.
Yeah, that's really great.
His son starts to make
stuff.
Buddy Allen. Yeah, it starts making records. He starts things like the Hagers and Freddie Hart. Like Buck really does kind of expand the empire at this point. And
there's a couple Don Rich albums.
Well, yeah, I was thinking, Don Rich and the Buckaroos start doing their own albums. You're right. Tom Brumley. There is this kind of cottage industry that is all under the Buck umbrella. I think also what happens is we have to mention there's a significant moment in July of '74 where Don Rich, his trusted lead guitar player and harmony vocalist, dies in a motorcycle accident up in Morro Bay, California. So this breaks Buck's heart. Again, Buck had discovered Don up in, I believe, Tacoma, Washington, and Don was a fiddle player. But Buck noticed that great harmony vocal and says, "I'm taking this guy, and we're getting you off the fiddle, and I'm going to put a Telecaster in your hand." And Buck Don's pretty much just imitating what he was hearing Buck playing on electric guitar. And then you mentioned the Ranch Party show, which thank goodness tons of that is still on YouTube. just a peek behind the curtain. In my 10 years with Dwight, kind of developed this thing where if Dwight at the last minute says, just feels like doing a Buck Owens tune, we've developed somewhat of a default position as a band, and especially with me because I play the guitar, and then with whoever we have playing pedal steel. It can be a mess if you just play over each other, and that never happens on Buck performances, never. So we, instead of trying to memorize, well, what exactly did the Buckaroos do on this given Buck song, we just kind of use a template in which during the verses, the pedal steel will play the call and response with, no, I'm sorry, I think I've got this mixed up because we took it from the Ranch Party show. That's it. During the verses, the lead guitar, I'll play the call and response licks. During the choruses, the pedal steel will do so. That way we don't step on each other. We get this because on the Ranch Party show, we see that, and even then, no matter what the record was actually doing, now they're doing it live on the soundstage, and Don singing harmony on the choruses inevitably, which means he's not going to also play lead guitar breaks while he's singing. So that's why when you watch the Ranch Party versions of things, which is of course a tutorial on how to play any of those songs, because the cameraman had good taste to get a close-up of Don playing those solos. So that always comes in handy for me over the years. But also you see these very, very clear ideas of who's going to play what and where. There were no accidents on this stuff. And by the way, Don, when he plays those leads, he's just smiling at the camera and making faces at Buck. He's not even looking at his hands.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just no question. These guys are as relaxed. They're like Daniel Day-Lewis. They've prepared and now they're just going to play. It's really, really impressive. I mean, that's what, as a musician, that's what I see. Like when I see that, I'm like, that's a badass band, because they do not make this thing look hard at all. They make it look like it's just second nature. Really, really impressive stuff.
You can walk through life. You can watch YouTube videos. You can read books. People are going to tear apart a Beatles album or a jazz album. And when I say tear apart, I mean tear it apart, break it down, talk about all the different songs and the different layers and stuff like that. Whereas they don't do it with Buck albums. It's almost like critics or music fans treated these country albums as, oh, well, yeah, country artists, they just release throwaway albums, because like Elvis in the 60s and 70s, for the most part, would go in the studio, record 30 songs, and they'd release that as 2.5, 3 albums over the next 5 years. I felt that every Buck project was a specific album and deserves the attention. I mean, even if you listen to the stuff, into the 60s and 70s, a lot of this omnivore stuff, these things have so many different layers. It feels like one emotion with 10 or 12 different flavors. Do you think in general that these albums have been overlooked and not really given the attention, the same detail as rock and roll, jazz, soul, all the other genres?
Yeah, well, they were definitely overlooked at the time. And we were talking about how he'd release like 3 albums a year. Well, peppered in there is like a greatest hits album every year, or that double close-up record, or and again, it was not, Buck was not cool, to when like Bridge Over Troubled Water album comes out, that when alongside All Things Must Pass. I mean,
yeah, right.
Buck was not the cool thing to like, and like we say, Hee Haw definitely kind of made that even worse. And Don Rich passing away, I mean, I want to say Buck made one other record after that.
Yeah, and then he pretty much.
Yeah, he moved to Warner Brothers. He moved to Warner Brothers for 2 records that are, let's just say, not his best work. Buck ran out of gas, and to his credit, he stopped making records. He continued to do Hee Haw until the early 80s.
Yeah.
But
I think that's significant, Ronnie. That's a great point, that he really didn't push it. There could have been a more embarrassing period there, maybe, where we know that Don was such a brother and support system. I think the story is that I don't think Buck really even liked the song Act Naturally when he first came across it. Don did. I think it was a little more of a Don preference, and he trusted Don's taste on that sort of thing. Maybe Don's energy, that happy-go-lucky energy, was part of it. You mentioned, the close-up. This is the beautiful with the fold-out. I think, Steve, you're right. I think we don't break apart country albums, even though country was doing a lot of concept albums at the time too. It's funny that we don't. There's clearly a prominence of having some sort of cogent thought per album, because up until then, why would I bother? I'll just buy the single when it comes out. It's a smaller investment. It's like, oh no, you're going to want to get this whole experience, you know. Then we forget Merle Haggard when we first see him. You know, he's kind of dressed up like in a train conductor's hat, and there's and then once someone kind of convinced Merle, you know, Merle, you should be more honest about. I think it was Johnny Cash convinced Merle to be more honest about his personal background, having done time in prison and those things. And Johnny Cash says, you'll be surprised how forgiving and accepting the country audience actually is for those sorts of things, because everyone knows somebody who's had those problems. Then that actually, I mean, Merle starts to lean into that identity a little bit for a few of those albums. I think that, yeah, they may not be concept albums in the Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Tommy.
Like we think of concept albums. Tommy. Yeah, they're not. Yeah. It might just be, you know, kind of just a bunch of songs with a city in the name is enough. But at least there was something that would bind these songs. I think
a lot of times it was emotion. A lot of times it was emotion. You know,
which is a very Sinatra kind of thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all just sort of links together. You know, sometimes, hey, it may not have been on purpose, but you guys know that as listeners of this stuff, we're all going to interpret these things differently. And a lot of times the way that we interpret things are completely different than the way the artist had intended. But I believe that most artists are really accepting of it. Like Eugene, for example, you put out a great album a while back called My Favorite Revolution. Were there instances where people had different interpretations of what the songs meant?
Yes. Yeah. In my case, a lot of people assumed there was a lot of personal journaling going on, because some things would be written in first person. And I said, oh no, that was actually something I observed. And it just felt a little cold to sing it third person. And since I switched to the first person, they assumed it happened to me, or I was talking about what was happening in my life at the time. So just a simple kind of a misinterpretation like that would happen. Or a lot of people with the title track, My Favorite Revolution, I try to make it very implicit in the lyrics that this is about my love of records. And so I use that word revolution, but most of the lines of it were pulled quotes from a book called Written in My Soul by Anthony DeCurtis, where he interviewed several songwriters. And I almost line by line, there's something that I could point to, like, oh no, Sting said that, Springsteen said that, Chuck Berry said that, Joan Armatrading said that, and every one of them is just a little pull quote in a way. I feel all of them, but there's really not an original line in the entire song, other than just the idea of using the word revolution. You know, that's sort of the only, you know, I think there's even, I kind of even cribbed something from Slow Song by Joe Jackson, but my song's an up-tempo guitar rocker, so you would never really kind of think the two have anything in common. So you're always obscuring things, but then people will bring stuff certainly to the table. And I think the artists, usually if they're smart enough, they try and step back and they don't want to color it a little too much, you know. Modern
top 40 country music doesn't really contain a lot of references to Buck anymore, at least right now at this moment. But if you listen to Americana, if you listen to rock and roll, all of these people are taking what basically they're listening to what Buck laid down, and they're picking it up and they're carrying it forward. Is that what you're hearing now? Country music is kind of worlds away from what it used to be.
Full disclosure, I don't spend a lot of time listening to it, but I know a lot of the people who make it. They open for us, we do shows together. And we have to, if we pull the camera way back, here's something that country music has always been able to do from the get-go. It's this incredible sponge. It absorbs whatever is happening in various music scenes, and it takes it in, and then it pushes it back out. So when big band music was the dominant music in America going into World War II, so we had Bob Wills, there were country big bands.
Texas Swing.
It could take it in and it could give it. Then when things after the war, when bands got much smaller, had to, because everyone was off to war. You know, rock and roll comes about, and country takes that and pretty much gives us rockabilly. It gives us Johnny Cash. It gives us that thing. And then when MOR kind of, you know, middle of the road music with the strings, countrypolitan develops. Hippies, outlaw movement, disco, urban cowboy, stadium level rock shows, Bon Jovi's like Garth Brooks. It has always been able to take whatever zeitgeist. Now, here's the thing. We know once we went to SoundScan, what were some of the revelations we had? Turns out that a lot of the white suburbs were listening to tons of hip hop. No one knew until, because the record companies weren't giving us numbers, but we were actually seeing what was coming through the counter. So we could locate these records. So when, let's say, you know, a 32-year-old guy, white dude is a country singer, and he, for the middle eight of his tune, he raps, I believe it. He grew up on hip hop just as much as he grew up on George Strait. Totally believable as an actual metric. So it's so Little Nas and the hip hop element of what we're hearing in country music now seems to me it's right on par. It's part of what country music will always do. And so in that sense, yeah, we actually don't hear much twangy guitar really in country music right now in modern country radio.
Yeah.
I don't assume it'll always be that way. I don't assume it'll always be that way.
Constantly evolving. Constantly evolving.
However, we did see, like say someone as recent as Brad Paisley, a lot of his big hits had some sort of pun or joke in the title. It would open with the chorus. There's still these subtle elements of the Buck format that are there. It may not sound exactly like them in terms of pronunciation or instrumentation. Now, Ronnie, my question to you is, kind of saying with the Americana thing, do you remember the cowpunk scene of the early 80s and what was happening there? Because to me, that's kind of where the Buck thing really, probably not an accident that Dwight ends up being the artist that Buck pulls in. Can you speak to that a little bit about what was happening there?
No, absolutely. Because I was into those bands like X, and then into Los Lobos, into
the Knitters.
That's what led me. The Knitter. That's what led. Yeah, the Knitters, and that's what led me to Dwight, because Dwight played with all these bands, and I should mention the compilation, A Town South of Bakersfield. Hugely influential. I know Dan, who put it together now, but I love all those bands on that record. And compilations, of course there's some good compilations, but they're generally a little uneven, right? But that record is just full of like, and all those bands were from a town south of Bakersfield, right? So like it says. So Dwight kind of inspired all these other bands, the Lonesome Strangers and stuff, and
Rank and File.
All that stuff. And like I said, the Elvis Costello, that was all happening at the same time. And that's what got me into country music, definitely.
Well, you remember,
definitely important.
You remember, Ronnie, somebody that we interviewed last year, one of his stories involved Dwight before Dwight became famous. And that was when we were talking to Jerry Rainey from the Beat Farmers. Yeah. So the Beat Farmers were part of that whole thing, although they were much south of they're a town south of Bakersfield.
It's still technically, south.
They're from a border town, The thing what I hear, is you essentially, in a lot of cases, a lot of those bands, you had punk musicians that were kind of just about burning out on the punk format and were reaching for something else, particularly in their songwriting. They dug up their parents' country records and found, wait a minute, still not a lot of chords, very straight storytelling. And they took those elements, and also just in terms of the tone of the records, very dry recordings, not a lot of reverb, not a lot of delay, not a lot of what we call a lot of spatial depth. It's all very in your face. Sound like someone we know. And also no fiddles or certainly no strings or ornate background voices. So they just inherently, there were probably two guitars, bass, drums. They're pretty close to that Buck and Buckaroo lineup there. And if you had someone that was saying harmony, two-part harmony is kind of all you needed for the chorus. That template was kind of there. So they, by proxy, to me, a lot of those early riffs, they just end up sounding a little more like, and plus it was the early 80s. So all the mixes were mostly treble and not a lot of bass slow end, which is also how this band sounded. So to me, they just ended up reminding me of Buck, whether they meant to or not. It was just, it's how it came out. And I think that was, I don't know how aware Buck was in the early 80s that movement was happening and that they were probably inadvertently paying tribute to him already,
Buck is a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame, Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame. He remains an icon, still very influential 16 years after his death. And he'll always be considered one of the greatest artists in country music history. For a viewer that is still unfamiliar with his music, but wants to maybe listen to a gateway track to introduce him to the world of Buck Owens, to the universe of Buck Owens, what song would you choose to introduce a new listener to Buck Owens? A song?
I'm going to name a track that Eugene talked about earlier. It'd be Together Again for me.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's just me. I'm not going to go for one of the more rocking songs. I love melody. I love feeling. I love emotion. And any answer is almost right in this for this question. But yeah, I would pick Together.
My tears have stopped falling. The long, lonely nights are now at an end. The key to my heart you hold in your hand, and nothing else matters. We're together again.
Boy, I'm looking at the list here, and this is probably, and I mean this in no exaggeration, the worst question you could possibly ask of another human being, Stephen. No, this is I would suggest from 1963, so it's still early in that original burst of hits. Love's Gonna Live Here Again.
Mhm.
Here's why. It's not that there's anything particularly significant about that record, not with the significance of Together Again. It's almost, if I may, it's almost the averageness of this record, which was a number one, that is why I would choose it. It's just, and we'll do this song every now and then. On a whim, Dwight will just go into a medley of Buck tunes. And so we've got to be on our toes. That's why that default position comes into play.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
know, okay, it's him. And just what happens to the audience's faces and bodies when we go into Love's Gonna Live Here Again. It's positive, it's celebratory, it's up-tempo, it's this really swinging up-tempo shuffle. Don and Buck are singing those harmonies up front. The guitar solo is fantastic. It's gut bucket blues, but played over these really happy major chords. It just has the way I always thought that Elvis he just inevitably made us smile. He gave us this positive thing about life. And I think that's overall what the classic Buck Owens stuff does. It just feels like sunshine. And so Love's Gonna Live Here Again is almost kind of just this, it's all right there. And then if you're encouraged to move on to Tiger by the Tail or Above and Beyond, now you've got some real gems coming to you. But I would start with Love's Gonna Live Here Again.
Oh, the sun's gonna shine in my life once more. Love's gonna live here again. Things are gonna be the way they were before. Love's gonna live here again. Love's gonna live here. Love's gonna live here.
If you're going to start digging into Buck Owens' catalog, there are quite a few compilations that Omnivore has put out. I think the most impactful, because you get to sort of hear them the way that everyone else heard them, is the singles collections, which are in chronological order. So you can listen to,
great.
57 to 66 and 67 to 70 and 71 to 75. And it's an incredible journey. Everything that we've talked about, during this episode of Exploring the Omnivore Universe. The thing I think that we've all touched on, either we've stressed it or we've just mentioned it, is the fact that there's so much emotion in what Buck Owens did. And I think that's why so many people have connected with his music over the years. Is it may not be overtly you're going to sit and you're going to cry in your beer, although there are some of those moments, but it's going to be those moments where he took humanity, he took reality, he took everything and he put it into music, and everybody could relate to it, and it would touch everybody in different kinds of ways. Like I said, we all interpret things differently, but the thing is that we connect with it, or we connect to it all in the very same way. And I think that's really what the music of Buck Owens does, is it connects everybody, it connects everything, and it does bring that joy and that happiness that Eugene talks about. And that's what I feel about the music of Buck Owens. Well, that's it for this episode of Exploring the Omnivore Universe. I'd like to thank my special guest, guitarist Eugene Edwards, who you can catch every day touring with Dwight Yoakam. Maybe not every day, but almost every day. And Ronnie Barnett, who you can catch every day if you watch repeats of Ronnie Barnett's Boom Boom Room on my channel. We'd also like to thank Kevin Reed, who was not able to join us today due to technical issues. We'd like to thank the people at Omnivore Recordings, and we'd like to thank you for watching. And we'll see you next time on Exploring the Omnivore Universe. Goodbye, everybody.
The beauty of her face was beyond my wildest dreams. Like cherry blossoms blooming in the mountain in the early spring. As we walked by the river and she softly took hold of my hand, that's when I fell deep in love with the girl made in Japan.